Hello everyone, today we talk about medieval mercenaries, a topic that we introduced here and there. We talked about the Brabançons, Cautereux, the Varangians. We have addressed the broader issues of the transformation of so-called feudal warfare. Is a very debatable term, even in itself. Today we will partly take into consideration. And today I would like to do something more generic, talking about mercenarism mostly during the low Middle Ages, right? And therefore also this time more towards the late than the high Middle Ages, that deals with the so-called crisis of the feudal system and its forms of military organization, touching especially the question of how much mercenarism was actually a detrimental element for the feudal order and hierarchy, right? Recently we talked about battles like the one of Courtrai, for example, so we addressed also the first half of the 14th century infantry outbreak. I don't know even how to define it, but that's a good picture because, as we have seen, we have this tense of substantially infantry victories. It means infantry alone winning over heavy cavalry. And Courtrai, we have observed how it marks fundamentally an era in some ways, or at least how historiographically there has been an attention towards the idea that there was somewhat of a linear growth, like in the importance of infantry, and a consequent decline in the role of cavalry. Now, this is not debatable in relative terms, because of course we can find many important events that, such as the aforementioned victories, that really mark a bit the inversion of a trend, if you want, because objectively cavalry had been growing and maturing up to the 13th century, and it will actually keep doing it in a way. Just in relative terms to infantry, it will lose ground, but at the same time, I have already explained in part how this trend is not really linear towards the end of the Middle Ages. I mean, the idea of the democratization of warfare, the rise of infantry, it's in reality something poorly phrased, poorly defined, for a couple of reasons. First of all, by the mid-14th century, there is actually a contraction of infantry warfare once again, with the Black Death and the broader socio-economical crisis. We assist to a proper refeudalization of Europe by certain standards. There's not to say that infantries disappear or fall back, as to the role they had covered before. Of course, infantries remain. They're very important. I know most of you probably are very much into, I don't know, English armies of the 100 Years' War, which is a very important chapter, but it's also an exception in a way. And it's also a very significant exception because it brings to the other point we're making here, is that infantry did rise at a point, especially from the mid-15th century, England being an extraordinary exception that makes one of the most famous and brilliant chapters of military history between the 14th and 15th century. There is no doubt about it. But this rise, and this is of infantry, and this is exactly the point we're going to make, is driven by the top, right? While in the first half of the 14th century you have mostly popular classes, commoners, peasants, rustics, that take a weapon in hand and manage essentially for moral reasons. I presume it wasn't even a matter of actual technique, right? And the video we made on the Battle of Courtrai actually is very exemplificative of that. But after that, you don't find fundamentally a true rise of infantry from the lower classes, right? In the mid-15th century, you have the Swiss that decide altogether as confederate government to start creating properly a stattal army. That was feasible also because of the political unity of the Swiss Confederacy. that represents in a way the beginning of that new way of infantry. We could say that opens to Renaissance warfare fundamentally. These pike squares of thousands squares of thousands of pikemen that had never been seen before. If not, if you talk about the ancient world, etc. But I mean, in medieval warfare, also what the same Swiss did at the beginning of the 14th century was very different from later on. They were essentially, even there, the pike was not prevalent. There was not the same level of collective training. It was a very different amatorial system. From the mid-15th century, the Swiss bring in professionalism. And naturally, when we talk about mercenaries, we talk also about this. The Swiss were pretty famous about, for the specialty up to Marignano. Fundamentally, they maintained the primate of in Western warfare, albeit already the French, the Austrians, and others have fundamentally copied their model more or less successfully, because the French, for example, we made a video on this attempt to recreate the Roman legions under Francis I and so on, creating essentially the French equivalent of Swiss pikemen. It fails miserably, and that's naturally, as always, also in Clausewitz in terms of political and social reason of the Kingdom of France. Right? So the French essentially keep relying on Swiss infantry as they had always done. But there are examples of success, such as the Landsknechten, and the also the surpassing of the model with the Spanish Tercio, and the beginning of the decline of the end, right, in a way, of Swiss primacy, and the beginning actually of modern warfare. There is something very different. I mean, the full maturation of modern warfare, because definitely with the Spanish, because definitely the Swiss had began that as well. That this is a kind of a technicistic premise. First of all, to set the basis that I've already repeated many times, but maybe if you've never watched my videos before, can be useful to get the coordinates right. But there is a greater problem, as I was saying before, that derives from the simplification of believing in this pattern that there was a linear growth of infantry, and that this equated fundamentally to a decline of the elites. This is wrong. Late Middle Ages are the triumph of the elite, right? And of course, it was also sometimes a mixed elite, right? Once was princely and feudal in nature, other were, bourgeois and patrician, right? Look at, the Italian dynasties that didn't belong to any, or at least most of them didn't have much of a feudal background, and this is just kind of formal difference. What you see is that it's objectively the feudal elite that survives throughout and reinforces itself throughout all things like the so-called term that I don't like at all, like the commercial revolution of the so-called Middle Ages. And we're talking about the 13th century, where that was the acme of feudal power, by the way, as well. So actually, and it strengthens all along, so much that what all we see as the Ancien Regime is born actually not in the Middle Ages like in the 10th century. It's born fundamentally in the 15th century, and this elite will keep ruling Europe, and in a way that, as you know, will not be national or statal in the contemporary sense of the term, and therefore a truly absolute state. Because not even in the 18th century absolute monarchies had a full power, but in fact it was still a medieval system fundamentally surviving, as it had always been, and also in other continents it had been the normality. So I will try to make a bit more clarity on this passage to get rid of this, which is fundamentally a teleological, positivistic and modernistic and also technologistic idea, for which at a certain point was the people who rule, right? It was most definitely not the case. All the big pike squares of Renaissance warfare were framed under rigid monarchic princely power and rule, also because those people were the only ones who had enough money to field these troops, given that their astonishing amount of collective training, professionalism, and so on. something that the free people never did, right? And even if you look at the Swiss model, that eventually declined exactly when this other system gets fundamentally to full maturity. Why do I say this? Also, why do I care? Well, because objectively, this was a time of great transformations, and it's easy to get lost into preconceived notions, right, and in simplifications. And that must be at least can be understood only if you give a dimension, a quantitative dimension to, right, and a perspective in that regard, in comparative terms. So there are important phenomena that we can observe exactly, in fact, for example, in the English case, there is, for example, an evident change in the, for example, the appearance and eventual disappearance of longbow and the modifications in agrarian structure in England, right? It's not an isolated coincidence either, but as we have seen, England was a bit of an exception because aside from the fact it was a very well-ordered kingdom, and this is not to say that it didn't risk to collapse from any second to another, because this is essentially what all medieval rule has ever been about. But exactly in parallel to the development of that specific professional army of the 100 Years' War, it also forms its own political and institutional stability, a specific relation also between the socio-economical powers of the country and so on. So there is definitely a modernization, in other words, that will be very important in the history of England, specifically of Europe, broadly meant. And we can definitely see, and we will explain this now, that feudal warfare entered in crisis. I guess the most important part of the video is exactly containing this phrase. I mean, yes, feudal warfare declines, but heavy cavalry properly does not, or at least it does not in the sense that it never leaves the top of society up to the Renaissance. And we're talking specifically about the arm, right? Because even during the Renaissance, still the same guys are at the top. This is quite important. The decline of feudal warfare and the one of cavalry are two separated things. I mean, they of course intertwine at a point, but they're not directly proportional. And especially, it's very difficult also to define what feudal warfare is, because at the end of the day, it was mostly a form of compensation, born in the high Middle Ages, also depending on when you want to make it start, what premises you want to use, because in many ways, many feudal realities by different degrees existed by default in the society. I mean, the clientele system, clientele systems are essentially always there. And as far as land is involved, you can even start talking about proto-feudalism or something like that. Feudalism, by some, is considered a bad word because they basically tell you exactly this, that there was never quite a concretely feudal reality. It was all very fluid. Well, I think it's one of those terms like Byzantine, right? That it doesn't, it's kind of fanatic to point out all the time that they're wrong. As the most important thing is not the term that you use, but actually knowing what it means and why. That it's a convention and an approximation, right? If you stop to definitions, to the problems of definitions or linguistical, just lexicon in history, it's never a good idea. It means that there is not much else that you have to think about, and in fact, it's becoming partly also a tragedy in storytelling. I will use the term feudal as you understand, mostly the vassalic beneficiary system, and the idea of an ideal military service carried out on the base of this essentially prepaid form of service. That is, simply I give you the land and that will do, right? It's like a credit card. Naturally, the thing had never worked. Surprise, surprise, and that's also why feudalism properly never existed in these terms. That is to say, ever since this system was born, it was rigged by the fact that, first of all, naturally the vassals autonomized themselves. They didn't perform their military duties in the same to central authority, to public authority, because at the end of the day, the king or the emperor, that's what they were, and they remained. So, as you understand, this has nothing to do eventually with the rise of heavy cavalry, right? Feudalism entering crisis immediately. Whenever you want to make it start, you can look at Charlemagne. It's too anachronistic to call it feudalism, but overwhelmingly correct to call it vassalic beneficiary system. It was also very advanced at the time, and that's essentially the root of the thing. That already doesn't work. Why? Because the Carolingian Empire explodes, and it explodes exactly for that reason. I mean, it doesn't explode because there were the Vikings, the Saracens, the Magyars. Those just came to eat the carcass, right? The thing exploded within itself because there was no state, there was no central rule, really. There was no public culture, fundamentally in Central Europe. So that was the only possible system to put things together. The church also, resisted better in a way, but as far as the laymen were concerned, this thing autonomizes and explodes. So it's a failure in that sense. But eventually, as you know, in the following centuries, there is this re-expansion of the feudal system. Why? Because of the feudal system itself. Well, in part, but also because there is this broader growth that whatever are the reasons that are just environmental, they were actually political. So yeah, maybe the vassalic beneficiary system helped to, as we've seen many times, to rationalize, to invest. It was actually a very open system. It has nothing to do with a closed courtly economy, as it's been believed for a lot of time. But the point is that there is a re-edition of what probably will become feudalism at a point. Feudalism never reaches its apex but by the 13th century, right? Which is also incidentally a time in which feudalism starts being paralleled. I mean, it reaches its apex, but it's paralleled also by the rise of city-states, of realities that basically had nothing to do with the feudal hierarchy, if not namely in the broader hierarchy of the broader frame of the hierarchy. But cavalry keeps growing throughout all these centuries as well. And surprise, surprise, even in the 14th century, when cavalry gets a lot of defeats objectively, in the 15th, where there is already firearms, etc., what does happen to heavy cavalry? It starts becoming heavier and heavier, and it starts being used, and it starts being used every freaking where. Nobody comes up by saying, you know what, we can't do without cavalry. No, nobody does, right? Even those victories we were talking about before, something temporary, right? Cavalry is always there. It basically doesn't disappear, even its heavier form at the beginning of the modern era, right? In the mid 16th century, the time of Caracol, right? It's always there. The function is always the same. You always need heavy cavalry. Naturally, it has dramatically shrank in its importance, but this is something we mostly observe, like kind of in the most advanced areas of Europe, mostly where pike and shot system was more developed in the West, fundamentally in Western Europe. But we see already in Central Europe or in Eastern Europe that feudal system basically was still there, right? It wasn't so, it was much more fluidified, but at the same time, the role of heavy cavalry was still there, right? And it will remain for a long time. So the question here is not to consider a necessary transformation of infantry from the beginning to the end in a linear and anti-cavalry fashion, right? Especially not at the political level, because obviously infantry has, the more it expands, it has this anti-cavalry fashion on the field as an arm, but it's still created by those people who went on horseback. So it's obvious in all of this that the change of military systems and institutions is unavoidably going in parallel with the change in social structures. Was there, a loss in the prestige and military functionality of the feudal chivalric aristocracies, right? Because at least, that was at least the same, that the origin of their own privileged condition, in part. Does it vanish, right, in the time, for example, there was any commercial expansion? Well, objectively, yes. But once again, as we've seen with the contraction, it comes back once again. And that loss was relative. As we've just said, the 13th century is the apex of the so-called commercial revolution. It was not a revolution, it was just very intense indeed, but still an intensification of what had always existed even during early medieval times. But the 13th century is, yes, cavalry does lose a little bit. They need better armor, equipment. There are crossbows, there are angry infantrymen on the field. But the 13th century, the apex of that commercial expansion, is the apex of feudal warfare and feudal hegemony, right? Which means also the hegemony of heavy cavalry on the field. So you immediately understand that this connection is not very helpful to understand what happened, right? Many people say, well, there were also new ruling classes emerging. Were there? I mean, think about the Kingdom of France. What kind of new social class? Of course, the middle classes were siding, but it's as if you expand the system, and the system is filled by this new space. Let's say is filled by some people, but at the same time, all this thing is managed by those guys that are at the top and that have always been at the top. I mean, are we seriously talking about the France of the 13th century? Yes, there is a state emerging. There are more commoners involved. There is more lay and non-noble personnel involved in the administration that make money and that also have their own means of interfering also with the local government and so on. Cities rise in importance, but that's still the apex of feudal warfare, of feudal reality there. And the thing is that once again, we have no evidence fundamentally of a mindset that at that point thought that the primate of heavy cavalry was being challenged by someone, right? Even on the field, this was perceived in a way, was perceived that infantries were ever more dangerous. But even in here, who ever said that infantries were not dangerous at the time? This is another thing that is very, or that had never been before. This is actually very important to understand because we often assume, that's another prejudice that I don't like at all, that feudal cavalries were somewhat this spoiled brats that didn't give that they dramatically underestimated the capacity of infantry, etc. If there was someone who knew perfectly well what was the capacity of infantry, were exactly the knights, because those were the people who literally fought against everybody, everywhere, in a lifetime, right? That's what they lived for. It's not that they had another specific field of application in their lives. That's all they did. Just imagine yourself, you are born just to be a professional military man, but not just, being sent overseas for some months, to do that specifically and to come back home and then to leave like a civilian. These people were fundamentally at war in every single environment they lived in, right? There was no other possibility of that, and these people were far beyond anything that we can't even imagine now in terms of even of the adaptation to the use of violence, the proper technique, the expertise, right? Really, I'm thinking the video I made last week about the Battle of Courtrai. That's an astonishing example how the French, for that battle in which they were disastrously defeated, to say the least, fought extremely well, right? And they did their very best, and they were one step away from winning. In that situation, knew perfectly what the challenges posed by infantries were. They knew perfectly all the thing of the ditches, of the trenches. They had even maps. They deliberately knew they could and did, by the way, charge across that. So the myth that this is probably really bad, because it's something I saw, for example, also in Outlaw King, in this new and interesting revival, a bit for low medieval warfare, also in what was the other one, Henry V, whatever, these things that they do on Netflix, that frankly I don't like at all, right? Not even artistically, because I don't make the point that if something is historically inaccurate, it's bad. I always value movies and stuff chiefly for their artistical quality, but it's also the message they convey that I think is quite important, if these things need also to be partially educational. I mean, this that's the judgment that the knights at a certain point were stupid, because the peasants made 2 + 2, and they understood, if we have ditches and we use these weapons, we will win. Leaving aside that a medieval knight was dramatically more intelligent than a medieval peasant, for sheer an overwhelming mass of capacities that he was simply trained to see. He knew the world. The peasant didn't. But that's also denying that's a technologistic prejudice, right? It's the idea that that is deeply also potentially racist and even just idiotic in general, as far as history of technology or societies or economy is concerned. That certain people fight in a way just because they are stupid, because they haven't understood how the mechanics of warfare on the field work. General advice: everything you see on the battlefield in every age, especially in a systematic and structural fashion, is exactly what works. And if you were not there, like the military expert of those, you have, chances are that the 99.9% is you haven't the slightest idea of what is the mechanism that worked on that field. Not just because naturally nobody studies history, or even more military history today, and gains a strategic culture of sort, but specifically because those people were there risking their lives, and you don't risk your lives doing something stupid, right? So the myth that the French, for example, were defeated all the time, which is not even true, during the 100 Years' War, also because they won in the end, but not just because of artillery, that was a more complex issue. Just because they kept charging and failing against the English men-at-arms and longbowmen, it's not by itself a proof that they were doing something wrong from a tactical point of view. People forget things like, as banal, as important as the fog of war, or just have generally a very poor idea of what even medieval sources fundamentally are. How it works to reconstruct a battle, especially, by the 15th century, where you have 40 sources, you have to read and study, you need linguistical, literary, historical, philosophical, technological competences. You don't just read stories or synthesis or 5 minutes videos on YouTube of how that battle worked, and therefore you become competent on the thing. It's an enormously complex thing, and the more you study that, the more you realize that it's not even concealed, right? It's not a matter of even of interpretation. And I can tell you, because I started, for example, back in the day, in the same way, I read some book about these battles and said, wow, this guy, obviously the author was telling its own opinion about that, and I said, what you don't expect how it is really in the sources. Then eventually you go into sources, you start reconstructing 1 battle, 2 battles, 3 battles, you arrive at 10, 12, you begin to have some idea how the mechanics is there from the sources, and you realize that there is no really even any such a difficult interpretational effort to understand something that, in fact, it's most of the times even explicitly written, that is that those who carried out those tactics were perfectly aware of the effects that the enemy tactics would have had on them, And they did that anyway. And the reason why they did it anyway, and you realize it because it was not an act of hubris, or just they were betting on on a card game about it. They they knew precisely what to do to counter that throughout their own means. And unfortunately, there are lots of prejudices that derive just even from other cultural backgrounds, right? If you believe, for example, you would say it's kind of silly, but this idea, for example, that the people at a certain point during the late Middle Ages emerged. This is aside from just a mistake, because everybody who has an historiographical introduction to socioeconomical changes in late medieval Europe knows that the people lose it, right? The people fail, especially the peasantry, that is the overwhelming majority of the medieval population, really loses a battle here. We made more than one video about how the peasantry had actually pretty good chances, but still by the 14th century, to gain its own space, even at the side of the bourgeoisie and the nobility at the table of politics and institutions. And I'm not kidding, right? And they lost it. They were, and we'll see it now also, they were taken out of the battlefield, right? They were simply oppressed / repressed. This is I'm not a social justice warrior of any kind, but I tell you, this is exactly what happened, because this is a violent reality. It's not right. It happened for some, they didn't notice. No, they noticed. I believe that actually some of the greatest changes in history at certain levels were perfectly understood, right? Especially when you see a world that that is literally destroyed in flames and in blood, right? And that's something that you don't say, oh well, there's it just happened by chance. There is a pretty sound and clear understanding of what the world was. Those people knew much better what their own world was than what we know about our own. This is absolutely evident at every level of our society, right? There is absolutely no doubt about this of any sort. The point here is that the more I go on and the more I realize that the prejudices that we have to win are not much just it's easy to shoot on romanticism, on the 19th century, even on the idea, for example, I can say not on nationalism, because nationalism is a real problem, but we can't presume that nationalism is just, for example, a 19th century invention. Right, it's surely that's where it took form and it matured and eventually passed down. But it wasn't born the day before. It comes from pre-existing ideologies. Think about confessional clashes. Think about the even cultural differences between different areas of Europe that wanted to stress different views of the world. Right. If you, for example, come from a culture where tyranny is the main problem around, even in the dialectical, in the political discourse, and there is a lot of moral blaming and all moralistic blaming and all this stuff, chances are that you're more willing to believe for specific historical reasons, because I'm referring to specific countries, and I'm not saying it's necessarily better or worse than other countries that, for example, don't give a damn about that, and they also pay the consequences for it, but also see things from other sides in a much more realistic way, to believe, for example, that at the end of the Middle Ages, it's that people that emerged, right? I can't make specific examples, otherwise, because I don't want to sound offensive or bordering or annoying, but there is specifically a Weltanschauung that starts from the assumption that at a certain point, either your people did the great thing, right? And it's the people, right? It's not maybe the aristocracy, or not maybe something that really even other countries had pretty homogeneously out there. It's all about the thing that you presume that your background stands out for, right? And this is something that we keep suffering today, right? I always say the Middle Ages is such a beautiful ground for re-educating Westerners about their own past, because it's a moment where that is actually that requires a much greater mental flexibility than even the modern contemporary era requires, right? Not because those are actually, I believe that they would require an ever more flexible uh, mind to be understood. In fact, I presume we don't understand the modern or contemporary era better than we do towards the Middle Ages. But the problem is that we are closer to those periods, and the problems we have in understanding them derive largely from the fact that there are more identifiable ideologies that that are more from one side they're more difficult to eradicate, but at least they're more easily identifiable. For the Middle Ages, you're distant enough to start reasoning a bit more detachedly, and also looking at a world that is substantially different from our own, at the point you have to rebuild fundamentally another mental base to start interpreting it from, and that's quite important in my opinion. And the topic of mercenarism is also connected to this, because you see, I often pointed out that the prejudice, the negative prejudice we have towards the mercenaries, which linguistically as a term is being invented with a negative meaning, right? Because there is no difference whatsoever between any soldier and a mercenary, and that's the trick. You say, so you are one of those guys who says that soldiers are all mercenaries, that they do it for money, they don't have values. You're probably a dirty liberal and all this. No, I don't do that, right? I'm neither a militarist nor a pacifist. The reason I do it is that literally there is no difference between anyone who goes out there fighting for money and what we define exactly by. There is no difference with the term. The mercenarism is a negative stigma that we attached specifically to the idea that if you are paid for military service, you're somewhat a prostitute. It's not true, right? And I will tell you more, that mercenaries very often were dramatically better and more efficient and even more loyal than the natives, right? This is what I presume military history shows overwhelmingly, right? And also consider that this is exactly the specific point in part I study also myself, because, for example, I can't say exactly what I do, but I read, let's put it in this way, I read the chroniclers of a region in Europe during the 14th century, incidentally, that got, that were describing the stories of the place, in a moment in which there were lots of foreign mercenaries that entered in and did naturally what all mercenaries do, that is, war and attached devastations, rapes, exterminations, and so on, which is no more nor less what the others did in the same way. These guys seemingly went harder, right? With that, in part it's understandable. In part, it depends also on the intensification of wars, and also by the same reason why these guys had appeared in that sense. It's just that the harsh judgment on these people is naturally deriving from someone that might have had political reasons to go against certain, for example, military models that were appearing. Why? Because they were discontent of the destructions of the mercenaries. Probably because they were more discontent in that sense with those who used them in that way, which doesn't eliminate what the atrocities that the mercenaries committed, but at the same time, these do not seem intrinsically different atrocities from what other polities used to do on one another, right? There is also a question of scale, of the intensification of warfare, something we will see also today, that the moment in which mercenaries start appearing is and the reason why mercenaries start appearing is just banally because there are more money around. And if there are more money around, this simply means that there are more powerful polities, and more powerful polities do a worse war than at least in terms of scale destructions in a given scenario, in relative terms that are higher than before, right? But we have to assume that, I don't know, the aristocracies of the early Middle Ages exercised less violence individually than they used to do before. Do you think that even medieval knights were actually kind and courtly and not killing each other? Because the chanson de geste, the courtly poetry suggests so. it's an interesting problem to understand, because historically I don't think we ever came to the point with this, right? We properly don't know yet, and there are many things that we cannot know, because aside from those idealistic works, there is also not much else for us to understand what the reality of warfare fundamentally was. So to progress now on the concept of mercenaries, I'm sure I was talking about lots of other things, about the prejudices of cultural, misconceptions, but whatever. This is all normal by a certain. We all do. We are all biased. We are all, speaking because we want to, because we have a narrative of some kind. Because otherwise we couldn't even tell the story if we didn't have a narrative. But the problem is that we should try not to be, to give, not to spread more doubts and certainties, because I also don't like specifically that philosophy. I presume that you do really have to arrive to a fixed point, but it's just we should. I must confess that today's video emerged because I read a passage that I was using for the script, the sketch that I'm using right now, and it said things with which I disagree, because I objectively did not see that, especially in the period that is taken into consideration, which is exactly the ones I'm studying. And I personally pose myself certain problems when explaining certain phenomena that do not really want to downsize even the negative aspects of whatever was happening there, but trying to motivate them on basis that probably have nothing to do specifically with mercenarism as such, right? This is the point I'm making. And also this other mostly socio-economical and also political institutional, even juridical misconceptions at a point. It is true, from another side, that the monarchies increase their power, so in a way also the aristocracies that are under the king are depleted of their martial power, right? They are co-opted most of the times, so that they gain greater political weight, but also they become less. But these guys still have their own clientele, they still have also their own money, they have their own mercenaries as well. And even in here you see that it's not by the 14th century, the 15th century, aristocracy fundamentally abandons heavy cavalry as the core of their armies, right? So the decline of cavalry as such is more subtle than it seems. It does exist, but it's not so open, and still the importance of cavalry is preeminent, right, over the other arms. And it had always been, right? Don't even say, I don't know, in sieges they didn't work well. No, because usually also men-at-arms dismounted were the stormtroopers of the situation. And of course, infantry is more important in sieges, but it's mostly for closing the camp around the besieged fortification, not because they had much of a dramatic capability. It's mostly missile troops that start becoming a thing. In that sense, it's mostly infantry, or at least that they mostly fight on foot. But they're not capable of withstanding cavalry. There is no army here that can stop cavalry with missile only, right? You need, incidentally, heavy infantry, and this heavy infantry too, supported by missile fire. At the same time, the same heavy cavalry that we see in other contexts. That's fundamentally what the English armies of the 100 Years' War are. Those were mostly mounted armies. Do you think that, during the chevauchée, the men-at-arms of the longbowmen marched on foot, then English armies were made of infantry? They were all cavalry, right? They were all, men-at-arms with heavy harness, the horse archers, and for reasons that are also very much tactical at some point, including the fact that most of the times these armies were overwhelmed by the number of the French, that the best thing was naturally for any other army, not just the English one, to dismount and fight in that way, which also produced in part the thing. It is true that the English had received in part some shock from the wars of Scottish independence, that since Edward II, the idea of fighting on foot after all was a bit the norm, But I presume that even in there is a bit of bias, in that we sometimes do not understand it wasn't much of a doctrinal ideal, or that even the English armies always fought that way, and that even when Edward III comes about and properly fulfills the this military change, very important. It's as close as the concept of military revolution that I can think, even though I don't like the term at all, because it's probably not even so, naturally, even in this case. But that was something grandiose, right? And not even there you have actually the idea that the thing has always to be on foot. So have you ever wondered about this, right? Who is the infantry? With the infantry, right, compared to other times, you have always these men-at-arms that are dismounted, right? It's not that they're all the flower of nobility necessarily. There are also new people. There is a bit of social, promotion even in these cases, but fundamentally, who is a man-at-arm? A commoner? No, right? So it's always the elite. It's always the chivalry elite, in a way or another. And the horse, the horse archers, the longbowmen, they are dismounted at this point as well, when they fight alongside the men-at-arms, famously enough, are also instead commoners, as the missile troops had always been. So what did actually change? And how much that proportion of missile and actually and men-at-arms actually changed also compared to previous times? Because have you ever made the comparisons of the numerical ratio and its changes over time? Like, do you even know? Because I tell you, by the 13th century we don't know. By the 13th century we know of cavalry only most of the time, even in the greatest battles, right? And we don't know much about the infantry, which was there actually, because it still is mentioned, but it's not described much. And the question is simply, we do not know how it was before. And I am maturing an idea that I may, at some point also write something important on, that most of what we see also in this dramatic change of the 14th century that has become such a dramatically important historiographical thing may have been not a novelty as we think. And that also the defeats of cavalry in the first half of the centuries are something more, not accidental, because there was eventually a systemical and structural reason for it, but it's not really because of a specific military change, right? It's not because of a specific improvement of infantry, for example, in terms of techniques or tactics. Right. As a matter of fact, the tactics of the infantry victories, of the victorious infantry, say it better, at the time, were dramatically simple. Right, dramatically simple. There was not a refined. That was what defined specifically those infantries. They were amateurs. They were commoners. They had never taken an arm in their hands. Right. The English armies are a bit different because they're already a monarchic invention. They essentially are professionals, right? So, but the men are the same in terms of composition. So it's not that there is a dramatic difference in Europe between how people fought, right? And don't think that while infantries were winning somewhere, the rest of Europe fundamentally was not as advanced or innovative because they didn't have infantry victories. That's also another mistake that nobody has addressed historiographically, as far as I know. It's all very blurred, and once again, I presume that the reason why this is not being pointed out is because there's been a bit of an exaltation of the I don't want to say of the single realities, the single context, but specifically, which also emerged from the sources, right? It's obvious that, I don't know, let's not make specific names, but these infantry victories were something clamorous that had never been seen. So it's obviously that they're important, that in the sources they actually exalt the thing, but still it's no historical proof if you really study even how the battles were fought that something dramatic in improvement was happening there, right? Even the tactics of the the English armies in the 100 Years' War, the thing of using the missile fire from the wings, it's something that was used in other areas of Europe since 40 years, and that about which nobody gives a freaking damn, right? And even in there, why do we talk about this in those terms? Because specifically was another context. But while the English victories of the 100 Years' War are a big historiographical topic, not just because the Anglosphere has prevailed, culturally speaking, in the world up to this point, but specifically because it was really a very important thing in our history. Yet the importance of that change is being projected on the technical side of the story too, right? So much that those tactics have become something almost national, embodying, think about the longbow. It became at a certain point the symbol of, even in Renaissance England, of the country of this middle classes, of a nation in a way, right? And that's the problem, in my opinion, that we have followed too much the specific, and we haven't compared the different realities and explained fundamentally what the point really is, really, in the practice of warfare. Just to make an example, as we were saying before, why are English victories during 100 Years' War so important in many ways? It's really an astonishing, because this makes them, in these terms of proportion and numerical proportion and fundamental symmetry, but France and England were materially and technologically homogeneous. I mean, there was no difference whatsoever. The greatest victories, and consequently the English armies, the strongest armies in the history of warfare, right? Because no army in history has ever achieved, in that condition of numerical inferiority and parity of material culture, that astonishing series of victory. So you understand here, the most important thing is actually not just much tactics per se, because the idea of supporting infantry or cavalry with missiles was already there. It's always been there. The point there is, and even less the technology of the longbow, for example, that had also been around since prehistory in Europe, but the fact that the English were so damn few and the French so damn many. And that's what I was saying before. Have you ever reflected on the fact that, in order to fight against the French at that point, with that numerical difference, the English were forced, obviously, to dismount, producing, therefore, that tactic contingentally, because to me it's really much more contingential than it seems, right? Because it's not that the English would renounce to mount their men-at-arms to launch a devastating charge if they had the chance. But when you do it when the enemy is overwhelmingly superior, the best thing you can do is to dismount and to exploit the advantage of defense, right? Also because, first charge, if it's over, it's immediately over, right? Because the first charge either it breaks through, and there are also other ranks behind, so it can get bogged down. So it's obvious you would defend. But we have, of all of this, we have drawn mostly not, and let's leave aside the fact that also the French at times dismounted. I mean, that there were factors that didn't help them at all, that didn't have anything to do much with their command nor with the English performance. But let's be honest about the fact that we have somewhat mononucleized that the military system and pretended that it was unique in its kind, while other countries in Europe fundamentally used missile from flanks and simply mounted troops because they had normally enough cavalry to cope with the aggressive shock of the enemy cavalry and hoping to overwhelm it in turn, right? And that would have been the standard normal tactics. But simply because, those guys instead, the English dismounted, now we think, look, the triumph of infantry. Then those are men-at-arms. They were used they were the same identical people you find from Portugal to Poland, from Denmark to Sicily. That's the same identical trooper. They have the same level of training, the same level of professionalism, the same level of equipment, right? They are equal all over Europe. Europe is dramatically homogeneous here, and especially by the 14th century. So I know I'm transforming this video into something very different from talking about mercenaries, but I presume it is important even to say this, because that tells you anyhow that, yeah, you can see the increase of mercenarism, the expansion of the market, but the winning guy is, at the end of the day, always the man-at-arms. And there's nothing to do about that, right? It's not even, I presume, it's not even about, well, okay, I want to give the longbow a shot, because objectively the longbow is one of those weapons that really challenges my anti-technologistic prejudices, because whatever it functioned like, and whatever the mass and employment, of course, was it, because, let's be honest, it was much more important given how many were the English longbowmen than what the longbow was as a weapon, right? The English longbowmen were counted in the thousands, right? They were enormous compared to the men-at-arms, proportionally speaking. They created an enormous volume of fire that, at that point, even if you had crossbows, in part, you may have achieved in similar ways, but they didn't. They preferred the longbow, and here I don't want to talk about the longbow versus crossbow thing, because in part it's tricky, even though I confess that I'm more favorable to crossbow. And I know some of you will hate me for this, but I think that in general, altogether, in the practice of warfare, crossbow was slightly better option, right? I don't even use the term superior or inferior, because they sounds like a competition, but I'm really talking about that. I know that this also causes disconcert and trouble and and criticism and so on, but we must get rid of technologistic prejudices, in my opinion, because they are very dangerous. They don't help at all to understand our point. Why? Because every time you find, for example, somebody who says that cavalry was useless because now there were crossbows and daggers and halberds and axes meant by infantry, well, when did cavalry disappear in all this? I mean, seriously, and I'm also talking about numerically speaking. The core. What's the core of a European army, of a major European army? It's thousands of cavalry. That's it. It doesn't change. It doesn't change during the 13th. It doesn't change during 14th. It doesn't change during the 15th. And finally, it does change when pike and shot arrive combined. Right? That really changes it. But throughout the low Middle Ages, it doesn't change at all. So much that cavalry, as von Clausewitz was saying, telling the truth, we were reading it yesterday, I think, it said explicitly that even the ratio of cavalry and infantry doesn't seem to have changed much over time, right? During early medieval warfare, early modern warfare, it did, actually, because it passed to something like 1-1 or 1-3, depending on, but in Napoleonic warfare, for example, it came back. And even in there, you understand that the factors are different, so that you have the same proportion, but what does this mean? It means that unitly, the various changes in equipment and such, and in technology and so on, after all, didn't alter certain intrinsic functions of the combination of the arms, or at least they reproposed in ways that weren't so distant from, I don't know, it's not that we started having fewer cavalry than before. Napoleonic warfare is just 300 years after the Middle Ages, so it's not even so distant. But this is really another thing we will not talk about. So, in my opinion, the myth that there was no, the idea that there was no sense in investing so much money in fielding heavy cavalry in this time is a myth. There's no evidence of it. You have the same exact contrary. You have cavalry that becomes overwhelmingly heavier, right? And this causes also certain changes in the way it was practically employed. For example, even the distance between the same horsemen during the charge that increase. The breeds are larger. The equipment, there are a lot of interesting things happening. And still, at the beginning of the 16th century, look at Maximilian armor. The idea was still that, cavalry can still take the field if it's course enough. Just at that point, firearms were bringing it to an halt, also because they began to become, only at that point, by the mid 16th century, so expensive that they're too much. Just you have a greater benefit to invest in more pikemen and musketeers, or certain specific firearm technologies like wheel-lock pistols and so on. But that still, by the way, imply the use of armor at many levels. Look at the pikemen, look at the same cavalry. But that's the point. That's properly the point of non-return, and you can easily see it if you look literally the jowls that a musket projectile contained, right? Already since the end of the Middle Ages, but properly you realize that while pre-firearms warfare, that you could, basically every armor was actually bulletproof, we could say, right? Never cent for cent, because even if we're not talking about the missiles proper, but even splinters, things, something could pass. There were horrendous wounds and so on, but substantially, like if you were, I don't know, a 14th century knight, if you went fully armored on the field, which indeed costed an astonishing lot, so only the elite could afford it, but still could afford it, and still structurally and systematically for hundreds and thousands of cavalrymen at a time, you were fundamentally immune from everything that existed on the field, right? I don't know I think there is no evidence of any man-at-arm in plate armor being killed by a crossbow or even a longbow bolt, right? Surely these things could penetrate plate armor at some level, at least to make it enough damage, but there is no evidence. Like you read some of the most horrifying things from these battle accounts and so on, but you never find a guy that is fully armored and gets killed by an arrow. Never. Unless he raises the visor and he gets struck in the face. That you find it. And so you can't even make a statistic of it. I personally did it for early 14th century, a certain region of Europe. Objectively, there is not. So that is what makes armor useful. And what you want to use, as long as, of course, it's still functional for you to, stand on your feet, which is what all medieval armor has always been. Like, if medieval armor hadn't been functional for movement, it would have been taken away. And that's exactly what happens in modern warfare, where that literally happens. But in the moment it happens, it disappears. So that's properly, it disappears. It transforms into something else, which is a compromise. But it's pretty well known that medieval knights made acrobacies with even plate armor on. Ask Marshal Bouchicot. But aside from this, this myth that it's an intrinsically technologistic myth. It's the idea that you have the infantryman with the halberd. He's going to really kill that knight. Well, no, in the arms system it's not going to happen. You can have the Swiss that ambush Habsburgic cavalry and attack them, when they're stopped. So the cavalry it's not in its specific function. And yes, you can have a good Swiss farmer that picks a halberd and cuts to pieces the horse and even partly the armor and the guy inside. And even for that, there is also to look at different things and how it was employed and so on, because it's. But the concept is that you find a condition of asymmetry there that is not created by the halberd. It's created by the fact that you're fighting a damn ambush, right? That's it. Or the fact that you don't break when a cavalry charge is taken in, but you don't stop it with a halberd, you stop it with a pike, which is being used since prehistory everywhere, and it was present in every single medieval army ever, in all times, right? It's not that the pike appears in the 14th century. There had always been in every single medieval army. So you see how it's easy to just dialectically get rid of the thing. Now there's this intrinsic, the new weapon that changes everything. No, it didn't happen. What changed the thing is how rich these communities were, how determined they were to maintain their privileges, their rights, how many other political connections they could find. This is what changes it. Then the weapon, paradoxically, is the least important thing. This. It helps, it's functionalized for sure, but it's not the key to it. And I would like to stress it, even for those events that, I mean, you would have not had English victories in the 100 Years' War, not even if they had kept fighting the same tactics of men-at-arms and longbow, if England hadn't been the kingdom that it was, with its specific political and institutional profile, with its unity. It was an end of old organization, of common interests at some certain levels. That is what makes the difference. That is what makes the difference. It's not the tactic. It's not the longbow of it, right? That becomes a symbol eventually. It becomes, because naturally it is what gets the thing done in a way, though, that is not much about the longbow in itself, but I repeat it. How many longbowmen were, right? Or even how many I don't know, it's something as ridiculous as much the arrows were, or how much they could be supplied, and so on. That is all what makes the thing. It's like the tip of the iceberg, and this is what people don't like to think, because it's much easier and also much more primitive indeed to simplify the thing by thinking that it's the weapon, right? And it's the example I always make, even for World War I, that everybody thinks that World War I was fought the way it was because of the new guns, the the shelling, the machine guns. That is just the tip of the iceberg. If we're not talking about those specific Western countries in that specific time in history, that specific theater of war, we wouldn't have had that, because the Eastern Front wasn't the Western Front. Okay, the African Front wasn't, I don't know, the Alpine Front. Things change, and they change dramatically before they can have an impact even on the battlefield. This is the importance of it. There is another aspect that is interesting, and it's actually the one we were saying before, that is about the organization of feudal warfare properly meant, right? It's the feudal institution that renders impractical, let's say, to perpetuate the service of vassalitic cavalry. But we could say vassalitic infantry as well, right? It's not a problem of cavalry itself, it's a problem of how these were levied specifically from the communities. We're talking about communities. We're talking about a constant negotiation with every single then community. How do you think that a king summoned an army? Because so every vassal presented itself. It was negotiated. Every single community, every single vassal had specific privileges, customs. Some vassals provided troops, some provided money. It depended all on the distance on the front. It was that complicated, right? So you wonder even why mercenary arms at a certain point came about. I mean, it's intuitive. According to the feudal norms, the vassals, as we know, was obliged to go to lead properly. Even if he was a bishop, for example, the military auxilium to his own senior. Right here, we're not even talking necessarily about kings. We're talking about the vassal, the sub-vassals, and so on. And it was generally for a short time, so short, as a matter of fact, that you immediately understand that given the the time was 40 days, usually a year, by the way. If you find a normal campaign that lasts 2 or 3 months, there is something that evidently is detached from reality in here. So in there, and this starts happening quite early, you already know that there are certain troops that either stay longer because they have any specific political interest, to appease the sovereign, to get a new post, a new office, a new fief, and so on, and other links that are actually very complex, or actually we say better, there were mercenaries. I mean, there were troops that were fighting there, also not necessarily paid, right? We're talking about marauders. People regularly followed the army just to loot whenever the army passed and looted itself. So it was relatively easy to achieve that because everything was much more fluid in this political and social fabric than we think. This is not to say it was easy to lead an expedition in these ways. Actually, it was very complicated. But at the same time, as we were also saying yesterday, incidentally, armies change by sheer practice on the field. They don't change much for doctrinal reason, right? It's not that a medieval monarch said, okay, now let's recruit this number of troops, but they have to be perfectly equilibrated from a tactical point. I mean, it didn't even happen in the Napoleonic era, right? It was summoned a certain amount of troops that were this critical mass that naturally would have been worn out along the play. Also because vassals sometimes said, okay, I've stayed too long here, I'm out, and came back home. But that specifically have this punching power that for that limited strategic goal will allow me to take the place. Naturally, there was a lot of also gluing factor related to whatever the interest, as we've seen, could be, right, to conquer a specific castle, a new land that could be given to new vassals. So there were people who fought really hard and that would stay, in fact, in the campaign for a very long time, exactly for that. But this doesn't solve by itself, for example, the material problems. You can be motivated, but you need your own equipment, you need to eat, right? That's actually the most important thing. You need to be maintained. So that's what properly pushes the monarchs to surpass the vassalic beneficiary system, because this had never worked, right? There's never been a historical period in which the vassal actually went to war at the given time with a given theoretically without being paid, right? And served and was obedient and everything worked. It never happened. As soon as the vassalic beneficiary system started, the service was paid fundamentally in a way or another, right? It doesn't have to be money, which is also usually what, historiographically speaking, we have began to trace, also because it's by the time of which money circulated, there is enough documentary evidence to track that. But we're talking could be everything on the political table, right? And that's what we often don't see, and that's why the myth of feudalism, the feudal military organization, is a bit that one, and we picture it rather too much, right? It's interesting because after all, every army in the world in pre-industrial systems worked in the same way, right? When we like to really determine precisely what the military service was, look at Europe. They fundamentally levied armies in the same identical way, right? Some monarchies could be stronger than others. This is true, and surely there was even a minimal of bureaucracy at all times, even in those contexts where it's been lost, etc. But the idea that the mercenary at a certain point appears and that before it didn't exist is also a myth, right? It's wrong. I don't know that there is also a very good updated historiography that insists on this fact, that is to say, mercenarism wasn't something common. Well, I personally cannot think of a time in which mercenarism was properly not common, right? Or that they didn't even constitute one of the most important aspects of warfare, because you see, mercenarism is also about finding troops at the moment in which you need them the most, right? It's really, it can really be critical. It can be the tip of the balance. There is also this capacity, therefore, to avoid the military participation by paying money, which is how eventually many mercenaries would be paid. For example, many feudatories, right, especially in England, preferred to pay a substitutive tax, the scutagium or scutage in vernacular, prefer rather than serving, right, in arms, which the sovereigns actually were fine with, because consider all the logistical problems that and the cost for the country altogether, that entails that you have to move literally from wherever these guys were scattered across England, to go whatever the gathering spot was, and to serve. It took a lot. Said with money, it's money that travels, and then eventually the king will spend that money at the moment with people that have already come there by themselves, because they are already interested to serve and they're looking for that money specifically. So the sovereigns were the first ones that actually tended to get rid of the feudal system, which is obvious, right? Very often the monarchies are much more in touch with the lower classes than with the aristocracy, to tell it all. And it's also from the lower classes, in fact, that many mercenaries come from, because this also seems to be something, so modern over social promotion. But if you think how the feudal elite had been born, you realize that most of the European nobility, they were no ones. But I mean, there were even serfs. Actually, many of them were serfs specifically, because they were the ones who made career under the senior in the older times. Well, maybe freemen didn't make much of a career in that regard, in order to defend their freedom. So today we will not talk specifically about it, because as we were saying, we talk about most of the Middle Ages. But we start drawing this picture towards the 13th century, when medieval civilization has reached the apex of its literally of its dimension, right? Meaning that this was such an enormous system that we don't even know how many tens of millions of people inhabited there, but it's something enormous, gigantic. We don't have enough documentation to really understand. With the construction in the 14th century, we get better. Paradoxically, in order to cope with the crisis, these people start to write more, to describe more than word, but the thing has collapsed already. But we can say that starting from the 14th century, mercenaries were very common, right? For example, all the Italian communal cities made regular use of mercenaries. The most important of these cities were, not surprisingly, transitioning from city to regional state, right? And their ruling classes, if they liked, the golden spores and dark gray fours, considered, however, war as a suspension of their, lucrative economical affairs, and an important loss in profit. Did this change the thing? No, because what happens is actually that these communities become ever more hierarchical. So basically, those who earned the most were also the ones that were, more prone actually to spend money for the military. This is, I think, very important, because when we think about Renaissance Italy, the first thing comes into our mind is Machiavelli. Yes, that's what I forgot to say before. Yeah, that when I was criticizing, the myth of the mercenary that we have. Some of you said, but it was not because I stress mostly that the contempt we have comes from the 19th century, from the nation state that says if you're not under that flag, if you're not of that nationality, you cannot serve your country. Absolute garbage, right? There is no evidence of this. Historically, mercenaries have performed dramatically well, and yes, it is true. Machiavelli was not even the first to say that. If you look exactly at the beginning of 14th century Italy, for example, in the sources of the chroniclers, they didn't like mercenaries at all themselves. And the reasons why they didn't wasn't just economical. But this is also a complex topic we should maybe address somewhere else. The point, though, is that they didn't like these mercenaries because they didn't like their elites to take over. Machiavelli is already something different, because Machiavelli arrives in a moment in which Florence is already a kind of a modern state, so he's actually defending the elite by saying, let's not spend so much, because warfare had become too big business for a state like Florence that wasn't such a powerful one. That the Italian states at the beginning of the wars of Italy were lagging behind compared to France, to Spain, at that point that were really the big new systems, also because they were much bigger systems overall, right? The Italians altogether actually were actually more powerful than them, but they were all split, and the reason also why they didn't want that they looked, of course, they didn't like each other very much, but specifically a war like the one would destroy the finance. So it's a very different context that is not looking much at the idea that mercenary is a bad guy, right? That's the moral judgment that is given to corroborate this from an ideological point of view. The problem is that these guys didn't want to spend much money, and they resorted to these militias that didn't work in the case of because Florence was literally the worst of all the Italian states. Like, they didn't like the war. They had developed in this kind, in fact, of economical ground, but they weren't like Venice, that actually had one of the most sophisticated militaries in Europe, or even the Papal States was fundamentally a feudal power with a lot of warlike aristocracies. So we naturally, for the enormous place that Machiavelli has in Western civilization, we read him, and therefore everybody has read him, has copied him, and repeated it. But the truth is a bit different, and the truth is that, especially by the 14th century we're discussing today, mercenaries were disliked because they were the longa manus of the power at the top, which usually the other aristocracies didn't quite like, because it was the bigger guy who was now imposing through these thugs, as any other aristocrat, by the way, would have been a thug. It would do in the same identical way its own power. Right, so the myth that this is being done because it's mostly the economical problem, it's not true. As it is not true that we were starting from this because there is this impression through Machiavelli that even the Italian regional states from the 14th and 15th century were somewhat anti expenditure. Right, this is absolutely not true. That's just maybe Florence, and it's not even true, because Florence is actually one of the very first states, together with Milan and Venice, that begins to spend a freaking lot of money for mercenaries, ever since the beginning of the 14th century. If later they had more problems, absolutely, it is true, because Milan was becoming more powerful, Venice was becoming more powerful, but at the beginning, there is no difference. And actually, these other Italian states, especially Milan, it was fundamentally a militaristic / expansionistic power. And not surprisingly, at the beginning of the Wars of Italy, the more state-like Italian power were perfectly fine at using mercenaries and armies of large size, and mostly, of all these soldiers, like crazy. Right, so even here, let's not even call them mercenaries. Let's call them exactly what they were. They were soldiers, right? They were soldiers, and they were exactly like all the other soldiers that had always been there. As long as you pay that guy, it doesn't matter if it's a foreigner or it's a local. They do the same identical thing, and we've seen it also before. All the Europeans fought in the same identical way. So if you were a man-at-arm because you were an aristocrat, or you were a man-at-arm because you had risen, you had stolen someone's armor as a peasant and started to fight as a man-at-arm and made a fortune, you were the same identical person. The same identical person. There was no difference whatsoever from any point of view. And I must say, Italian warfare during late Middle Ages should be studied much more carefully, because aside from the synthesis of Mallet, etc., it's been, in my opinion, grossly misunderstood. Not much for the technique or warfare, whatever it was, which is partly maybe also the case, but specifically for considering what all this culture of that eventually would give food for thought to Machiavelli, and that has exploded in Western mindset, derived actually from. Because I think we have taken one of those hallucinations that have ruined a freaking lot of things, right? And that still make us believe that the mercenary is a bastard, and while it's just a soldier like anybody else, right? And I insist though on the fact that it's really the 19th century that has ruined the picture because it has attached to it the implacable stigma of nation on it. Right? The problem is not just that these were mercenaries, but for example that they were foreigners. And this is idiotic, right? And this has just spread distrust, hatred, all what nationalism naturally has brought about. And fundamentally denying also certain realities that worked fairly well. I mean, if you, as you know, I presume the Middle Ages actually truly ended just in 1918. And before that, we had multicultural empires that were not bad. I mean, if you look at the Austro-Hungarian Empire, right? Okay, they didn't perform excessively well in the First World War, but it was still a functional system, right? And in there, the problem was exactly nationalism. That's nationalism who destroyed the empire, aside from its enemies, of course. But, I mean, Hungarian nationalism was a problem. Austrian nationalism was a problem. I mean, they were denying fundamentally. I mean, Hungary, maybe I could even understand the fact that they had been, conquered by the Habsburgs and at a certain point treated as something different. But the worst thing there was that the Austrians bought into pan-Germanism while they had this beautiful, and I want to stress it, beautiful universalistic idea that albeit the Holy Roman Empire didn't exist anymore from 1 century, but still lived of the idea of the harmony of between all these various communities that of course weren't harmonic because they fundamentally didn't like each other very much, as always, but at least it wasn't loaded in the hatred, in the nationalism, in also of the ugly things that happened, as we all know, in the Balkans 30 years ago, and that still showed us after World War II that a genocide can happen next door to what you believe we are, the civilization, and instead derives still because the matters of the Ottoman Empire, of Austria-Hungary, and all the ethnicities lived there have not been settled after the dissolution of these systems. But aside from this is another digression. It's not entirely necessary, but it's important to frame the concept of mercenarism in these terms, because until we get, I use the term mercenary, right? It's not wrong to use it. I use it even on publications. I wrote something about it, but I want to use it exactly to detach from it any stigma whatsoever. Like, to me, mercenary is synonym of soldier. That's it. Right, and I prefer soldier when I can, usually. But the mercenary hits the most, and this proves how rooted this idea, this prejudice, if you want, is in our own culture, which is not a dramatic problem. Like, it's not that there are much worse problems that we have in our cultures today, but it's one of those that do not help. And especially they do not help because they make you see in a very narrow way what the fluidity of a Clausewitzian vision of the world actually is. We all fight for money. We all do something for money. And even if it's not for money, it's for something that can be quantified economically. So we don't have to be hypocrites by the slightest, right? So, as we've seen, one of the advantages of mercenaries is the fact that you hire people who just come by themselves to make the job. This avocation, let's call it in this way, of the local communities from military service, compensated with money through the king whatsoever, is objectively at the base of modern state building. Right, basically the most of the dialectic existing between center and periphery in this medieval reality, these ancien regime realities, is the negotiation between the two of the conditions of military service. We have seen it dramatically, for example, in the series of videos we started doing on Vienna 1683. Incidentally, states like Austria or Prussia, would fundamentally turn the tides in this balance just by the 18th century. So it's something very recent. Before that, these worlds were fundamentally still medieval, right? And as we've seen also, conceptually, they would remain up to the end of the First World War, which was not necessarily a disadvantage at all. Or better, yeah, in part it was actually, because whatever, now we can't digress, but it wasn't the end of the world. I mean, given their specific conditions, they still worked in a way. With all the changes naturally had occurred during the centuries, I mean, it's not that the 19th century, 1918, it was just the Middle Ages. Not even in Russia, it was actually the Middle Ages before the Bolshevik Revolution. But those were the relics of it, in a way. So the mercenaries took off from its own clients the burdens of the boring and heavy organizational and administrative necessities, procuring them, at least in theory, well-equipped, well-trained, and effective troops. It's important to stress here, in theory, right, because not everything that is professional actually works. Not all that is non-professional cannot also become professional with use. And this is another element of homogeneity that actually exists in these centuries of change. That is that still armies are pretty unwieldy things, right? The idea is that the logistical problems once of the fundamentally remained, right? The problem of mercenarism it doesn't even exist, right? Because as we will see in a while, also, who were these mercenaries? They were the same people that inhabited the land, right? They could come from somewhere else, right? And it does happen, also for important reasons, and also for crisis of certain political social stance. Think about the German ministeriales. If you wonder why there were so many Germans in Italy during the 14th century, for example, well, that was because the ministeriales, with the rise of principalities in Germany, had remained without work, because basically the Habsburgs, the Luxembourgs, the Wettin, the Hohenzollern, etc., we were building their own, starting to build their own state in Germany, and this professional military class that was essentially a feudal relic of also even theoretically non-free knights, because the German knighthood were essentially a servile one. That's an exception in Europe, actually. At this point, they do not find enough job. Italy is rich, is divided. They basically fight against each other like crazy all the time. So what a better place just across the Alps to go find a job. And actually, the Italians are very happy of it. I mean, the myth that the soldiers of fortunes were this disastrous thing that the Italian powers couldn't manage, that it was a terrible moment. This is a bit of an Italian historiographical invention of the 19th century, right? Of romanticism, of nationalism. Actually, these guys were perfectly fine with that. And also, they had a pretty good control over these companies, contrarily to this what is commonly thought. And they surely knew how to play them with them by sending them against each other pretty damn effectively. And if you wonder, how also humanism and the Renaissance is born exactly in these regions, exactly in these years, well, look at what was happening within the Italian armies, with the foreign mercenaries, and also what was happening internationally. I mean, you couldn't understand this period if you don't study the 100 Years' War. Think about John Hawkwood, that was not just the most famous of the foreign mercenaries fighting in Italy, but also the one that, not surprisingly, actually, as an Englishman, had actually the White Company, so-called White Company, had the best company actually of the best organized and most effective company of this period of the 14th century. Think about the movement of people, right? This is important. Like having someone that wants to fight for you is because you have money, right? Let's be honest about it. If you find them there, it's because the local powers had money to spend in that. And there is an internationalization also of European military culture, because literally mercenaries here came from every freaking where. Naturally, the most preferred regions were the poorest ones, so the ones that couldn't find jobs and went fighting abroad. But generally speaking, here we talk about people coming from all over, all over. You don't find in Italy, in France, but just one or two or three prevalent ethnic. I mean, they come from everywhere, everywhere. They come from all over Europe, all over. Spain, France, Britain, Italy, Germany, all the Central European lands, Hungary. You find them from everywhere, right? So it's complex and it's fascinating, because all these peoples also brought at some point some of their knowledge, like some of their even military traditions and styles, right? But this is another topic. Maybe we'll see somewhere else with another video. Aristocracies, bourgeoisies, and peasantry were partly left aside now in the business of war. We're starting being less involved in it. And this mercenarization, say, of warfare does correspond to the centralization of power, for sure. This stance were left, let's say, free in part. The peasantry especially wasn't free. It was start really from now on not be free much more, to however consume the rents, to accumulate wealth, to produce goods, depending on whatever we're talking about. And this is, as we were saying before, the first step towards the absolute state. It would take literally half of a millennium before it was accomplished. Naturally, there was an interest broadly meant to disarm the population as well, which naturally proves how this change was also led from the top. Lords, oligarchies that were power in kingdoms, princedoms, city-states, etc., didn't like particularly that their subjects used arms, right, and they were military trained. That's why also, there was a subversive risk, a revolutionary one, the one of arms. That's why Machiavelli is so an hypocrite, right? Machiavelli has written some of the most beautiful things ever, and especially an enormous amount. If you just we know the art of war, the Prince, and so on, but Machiavelli wrote an astonishing amount of stuff, and it's really a sight in the mind of finally of a modern, not anymore a medieval man. But the truth is there that the mercenaries were in a way less subversive than what a local militia could be. Why? Because the options were two. Like, the mercenary can become unfaithful at some point. Hell, there were mutinies, there were even coups led by mercenaries. But the problem is not because they are mercenaries. The problem is because they are powerful, right? And they are people. They're not bots, right? So everybody would have done it, but at least they were often detached from the local reality. While if you equip a local militia and you start making it become professional, you basically create within your own world a new class of people that that knows how to make war and has properly the military and therefore political power in the city, and can take over from the within. Instead, the mercenary, at least when you don't need it anymore, it can be a problem because they maybe don't want to go away. They will maybe force you to keep them employed, as it happened. But at the end of the day, they're going to leave, right? It's not that these mercenaries, for example, settle down most of the times. I mean, this starts happening mostly with the local aristocracies that were already native. This is something, for example, just to come back on the condottieri in Italy, that start happening exactly from the 70s of the 14th century. That is when basically the mercenaries from virtually all foreigner that they were become virtually all Italian, and this in a way helps to, and you see it with the rise during the 15th century. Some of the most important dynasties there, the creation of new, of can say of a new social class, but at least new feudatories, of new properly of lords that fight the war. And most of also previous mercenaries were, especially the heads, the company leaders, etc., were usually aristocrats. Let's be honest about it. The very beginning of mercenaries in this regard is of nobility that by 13th, 14th century standards knew pretty damn well how to make war, because that's all what they did. And since maybe because in their especially mountainous areas, these places here, they didn't have enough local resources, they went serving the greater powers of the flatlands. They made money, they made a fortune, then eventually they resettled where they came from, and they started building their own lordships from there. It's very typical. And this is also the point we have to consider. Here, there is no state that properly finances this regularly, these realities, right? There is no permanent army yet. So the payment is una tantum. The states are not very happy to pay. They pay actually a lot of money, but they do it, by, let's say, every once in a while, right? Once at a time for the specific employment, right? So that at one point we'll have to make a video on how even the condotta developed, how there were changes in the state, in the politics, in the progression of this all, because of the payment to the mercenaries, right, and the forms of payment to the mercenaries. But most of the times, these companies actually equipped themselves by themselves, right? Either because they were guided by an aristocrat that had money on its own, they had land, right? Or because they looted around. In a way or another, they got that money. They managed to organize themselves, because here you really do not, what you do not see, I don't know, a bunch of peasants that knock at the doors, the city gates, and say, look, government of the city, can you train me as a mercenary? Nothing of this ever happens. What happens is that the city takes contact with certain companies or certain aristocrats that are already in the area, that are already an effective military unit, and this thing was largely present at the time. I mean, the medieval reality was a largely militarized one, right? People knew were apt to war. So naturally, over time, there is ever more training. There is also surely the creation of semi-permanent armies, even just for example, of fortification systems. There is an important change that we'll have to see in another video, because today we don't have time. So there is a progress of creating this, what you could see as a national force, the militia that Machiavelli talks about. By the way, Machiavelli doesn't refer to a militia of Florentines. He talks about a militia of peasants that are those that inhabit the countryside, not that within the city. It's a very different thing. But the ideal, the hypocrite ideal, for which, of course, also the Florentine military would perform so poorly, is that these guys were not professionals, right? They were given arms, given this summary training, and pretending that they will work as professionals. Militias are not professionals, right? That's it, right? You need the condottieri there, which is a different thing. So it's fascinating, really, because here there is a great inherent conflict between the political and social forms that such military systems require, in a way. And there is also a world that changes. There are new powers rising. There is a new way of seeing the world. And believe me, it's not easy, right, to look at this period in Europe and saying, this is probably the moment in which that homogeneity that we're talking about before starts disappearing. Because if you arrive at the end of the Middle Ages and you have something like France, and most of Europe, especially Central Europe, is all fragmented. And this is something will remain up to the 18th century. I mean, which are the great monarchies? They're fundamentally France, Spain, England, right? Or if you look at Germany, there are some princely states fundamentally. Italy has this regional state, but those were considered historically the so-called Germany and Italy, so-called weak regions of Europe, exactly because, first of all, either were transformed into battlegrounds or they were fundamentally easily infiltrated and influenced and so on. But that's a model that changes with the modern age, that in the Middle Ages had not been seen, had not been conceived, right? Everybody believed that every community was still theoretically autonomous. Now, the modern state becomes something very different, and it definitely emerges from great shocks, right? You could have not had probably the France we talk about in modern times if we hadn't had the 100 Years' War, because France risked to be wiped out as a system for all the improvements, all the accomplishments had been achieved in the previous centuries, but the reaction to it was astonishing, right? So we start seeing really a difference in scale, in the form of organization of the simply. You can even look at the amount of money spent for the army, right? Nobody spent how much the French did at the end of the Middle Ages, because they were objectively the most advanced, right? Now, what else could we say? We're talking about surely the risk of a revolutionary subversive use of arms, right? Especially in a moment during the mid-14th century where, as we know, there was a deep economical crisis, and there were important malaise that and revolts that, as you know, had to do with the lower class, salaried classes in the cities, or the peasantry. Think about all the revolts in the textile center, in industries in Flanders, in Italy. Think about the jacquerie in France, right? That's the moment to which the masses awaken, but they're brought down once again. They're brought down with the force of arms, mostly mercenary, or still, however, soldiery, right? And that's where they lose, where the elites strengthen everywhere in these countries, and they manage to crush in parallel also the infantries that these guys fielded. So goodbye victories of infantries of the early 14th century. There's no progressive, linear transformation, as one would believe, at all. Those guys fight mostly with heavy cavalry, right? And they don't want to have many thousand infantrymen at their service because they're dangerous, right? I mean, the English can do it because at least they go fighting in France. So in France they can do whatever they want, exterminate, rape, etc. So they can have all the money they want. And it's also why the aristocrats fight there. At least England is spared. They have to pay a lot of money for filling the armies. This is true. And they also have their own revolts, and also pretty upsetting ones. But at the end of the day, and they had that valve of, for venting the creation properly of a professional army like the English one really was, as an exception at the time. Then in fact, when the English lose the 100 Years' War, also finishes, right? And actually England doesn't have much else there to compete with from inland for fundamentally up to the new model army. And these differences will be felt in the later times. So this is also an important motive, disarming the populations, and as a consequence there is, as you understand, an ever bigger gap between the soldiers and the common people, right? Consider also the expenses of equipment. by the 11th century, like the panoply was relatively simple. It was relatively similar to previous centuries, right? I can say everybody could have it because also was a much poorer world, right? Armor was rare in a way, but that's what made it. After all, the forces involved on the field were less powerful in a way. Now it takes a lot of background money, or say, resources and time to be effective on the field. So even the same militias that they didn't want to go to war because they thought about their shops and etc. At the end of the day, they're even fine that someone else is going to war for them. And that's also part of the reason why infantry warfare declines by the mid-14th century. Because war is not a sport. This is also really important. Like, the aristocracy does it almost like a sport, even though it's much more dramatic. But for the people, if they go to war, it's because they are brought to no choice, because otherwise they would never do it. And the worst about that is they make war to kill, and to kill badly. That is not that aristocrats didn't do it, but at least they had maybe some more complex interest to maybe to take prisoner and ransom and so on. They also killed each other quite easily, by the way, but the people didn't by definition. That's also why, for example, think about the panoply, the development of plate armor and so on. That happens because weapons like crossbows, longbows, etc. Do not look at what they hit. Right, they're typically democratic weapons in a way, because they derive from that tradition. But it's used now. It's framed gradually at the service still of the elite, right? In fact, let's be honest about it. It's not even the strength of why do the Swiss make the difference in mid-15th century? Because they are a lot of pikemen, well-trained collectively, something that never been seen in medieval times. The feudal powers maintained cavalry also in stand in this centuries, because after all they need is cavalry plus missile troops. These infantries that win in the first half of the 14th century do not leave a trace in the military organization. We were seeing it with the Flemish armies. The Flemish armies win this great battle of Courtrai. They obtained some other results, such as Montpellier. But for the rest, during the 14th and 15th century, if you look at Flemish military history, they don't just get defeated, but basically they get a military disaster after one another. And they all do against feudal armies, which is beautiful, because fundamentally they against princely armies, which proves absolutely that's for example one of the clearest examples of what I'm talking about. But because Courtrai is literally the greatest victory of infantry at that point in 1302, you would think that would open to a stage of development of infantry, but not by the slightest. The Flemish keep using that system, and they keep getting defeated time after time by all the surrounding enemies. So that is so much the proof, paid dearly, of the fact that if you don't have professionals, you can even have lots of angry commoners and peasants, but on the long run it will not work if there is not a further evolution in the step of warfare. So the fact that the majority of European armies in the most advanced military cultures of the time did maintain throughout all the late Middle Ages heavy cavalry and essentially missile troops, which are not masses of thousands. Maybe, in the armies of Edward III, of the English armies, yes, the longbowmen are many, but they're not self-sufficient. They're not an alternative to cavalry. They're something that work just because they work with cavalry. Right, they cannot hold the field by themselves. So it's fundamentally still heavy cavalry that makes the thing done, or men-at-arms dismounted, whatever. But it's still the elite. It's still the elite. This is crucial. If you get this, you get half of late medieval warfare right. This doesn't mean naturally that here and there is not the angry peasant that manages to strike but usually that angry peasant is exploited by a nobleman, right? Even these great victories of, in Germany, there is something towards the end of the past, where was it? Like, we even talked about it in that video about late medieval Germany. But, I mean, you never find, like, an army only of peasants, or only of commoners, or only of aristocrats. It's always mixed. It had always been. After all, at Courtrai, the Flemish commoners were led by knights, right? That told them what to do, because they hadn't the slightest idea what they had to. They'd never taken a weapon in their hands up to the day before. So really, if we don't get the centrality of professionalism, because the elite is professional. You see here, the elite keeps making war day after day. I mean, if you're elite, you're still a knight, and you still go to tournaments, you still go to war, you still do that your entire life. Nothing changes, right? The fact that there are better weapons, firearms, for a while, for 2 centuries, remains, however, secondary. The first thing is always the elite. And always the heavy cavalry, and still, even with firearms and plus pikemen, pike and shot will be, it's still the elite that commands those armies. Okay, picture it. Excuse me, I drink a little. That's really important. So, this thing also of picturing, it's always very plastic. The idea that you have the heavy cavalrymen that basically cannot be stopped more than much anymore, right? Some of you will come up with examples like the Hussites. We also made a video about the Hussites, and we explained that. We explained the fact of how, for example, there was possible. We explained how even the chapter of military history that is objectively very important probably could have not happened but in Bohemia at the time, and against the Hungarians, against the Germans, because that was a specific area. Had that happened, the tactic being involved, I don't know, in France or Italy, probably things would have been very different, right? If anything, for the spread of artillery. But even in there, everything has its own context. If you buy those books of disclosuring for, a non-specialistic public and so on, and you start just gathering examples from here and there all the times infantry won, yeah, you can give an idea of the picture, but you need to be, it's as if you put everything on the same level, and actually different contexts do correspond to different levels, also because different areas of Europe have different levels of development, and we have to be also very concrete about that. But indeed, the old let's say feudal system is shocked. I mean, I keep saying feudal because, I don't know, this is also the time in which heraldry spreads, and there is this better connotation of who the nobleman is, right? So in telling the truth, much of what we think is medieval is a modern thing, including heraldry, for example, not medieval strictly. But let's say that there is this chivalric, we could say, better than feudal, because as far as the vassalic beneficiary is involved, as we've seen, this function stopped at a point. I mean, the feudal system was actually still standing. Of course, there were vassals and lords, and you had to serve the lord. It was always the same thing. It's just that the forms had been integrated with mercenaries. Feudal levies, militias were always there, even well into the late modern age. They were there. There weren't many other ways to make the thing work. But the idea that there is this core of professionals that remains there, that is always more present, etc., is fundamentally at the base of also standing armies, what will become standing armies. Right? The very first corps is seen in 1356 among the French, which was just an army of mercenaries that was not disbanded after the war, right? So if you want, that's an interesting way of seeing also the beginning of, say, permanent armies that at this time we define as semi-permanent in a way. But the concept fundamentally, yes, it starts from there. It starts from having these soldiers that you keep maintaining. And that's fundamentally it, right? It's what we have still to this point. So the old social military, let's say the old Germanic social military system, in part was maintained. It was maintained ideally. I mean, the levy of all the common people, of the freemen, right? Is maintained. It's maintained everywhere, even by the communal city-states, right? Every freeman, every citizen was an armed man, and therefore the exercise of freedom was identified in the use of arms. But at the same time, the reality starts being that mercenaries begin to take over in a way or another. The mercenary market was florid. It was, from an important amount of time, the mercenary is a constant figure of the medieval, warlike world, let's say. And I would conclude just with a point on how early actually mercenarism began, because here we're talking mostly about the low Middle Ages, as we've seen more towards the late medieval period. But these mercenaries also did not begin by the 13th and 14th century. The concept of, I mean, the best documentation we start getting is more eloquent about it. But mercenaries had always existed, and especially from the 11th century, the mercenary becomes a protagonist, right? The chivalric aventure, nothing is but often literary transvestments of a mercenary service. Think about the Varangians. We talked about them, made a video on them, and we explained how they came about, right? In the Byzantine Empire and so on. The Normans that are a bit there, considered their heirs, but technically they were even their opponents at some point. But they tour around, the word Normans, of course, even within the later Byzantine. I mean, here it's complex to be precise, but let's say that there were also a lot of Latins, so-called, as they were called in the Byzantine Empire, that participated. It didn't just come from Russia, right, or by the Anglo-Saxon refugees, but also later on that were, French, Italian, German, people from specifically Western Europe. They came also to be, think about the Akritae of, the Palaiologan army of the time of before Constantinople was reconquered in Asia Minor, where there was a very heavy Western military culture in those lands. Were settled, literal people settled in there as thieves older, fundamentally, and also because they knew how to make war. It's interesting to think at how early this began. We've seen it in the organization of Anglo-Saxon armies, and also in the late Viking era, when, for example, William of Malmesbury qualifies as stipendiari and mercenari milites, the housecarls of Harold Godwinson that fought at the Battle of Hastings. Objectively, those were mercenaries, right? They were paid regularly, and that thing had begun mostly, not much in England per se, but because of influence that, think about the time of Knut the Great and this great, imperialistic ideal and ability of exploiting tributes to pay this troops and so on. So that is a thing. That's also, by the way, why at Hastings the housecarls were so hard to crack, and they basically didn't because they ran downhill pursuing the Normans. Otherwise, they wouldn't be broken. And given the feudal customs were hinting at before, it would have been normal that the Vassi, right, once they spent their time of servitium debitum to arms, that is, once they had spent those 40 days, after which they were not to be there anymore. That's how early and how much the feudal military service had fallen, right? So they would leave even if the war was not over, right? But in practice, as we said before, these guys could transform themselves, could essentially turn their feudal duty into a mercenary one, right? The same Vassi, as we've seen, the same knights that had to stay there for their senior would say, okay, well, my service is over here, but if you want to remain, just have to pay me. Which is ironic because, as we have seen at the end, this system, those 40 days were not just how much the vassal stayed unpaid, as theoretically the vassalic beneficiary system is, because you're already paid by the fact you own land. No, they were paid extra just to go. So that is crazy, right? And you understand this, that thing had never worked. And at the end of the 12th and beginning of the 13th century, France was also tormented by a phenomenon that we have treated in the video about the Brabançons, and these are centuries in which also the lower classes start rising. So there are a lot of people, really a lot, quantitatively speaking, of déracinés, of outlaws, vagabonds, escapes that were reunited in bands that alternatively actually sold their service to whoever wanted to hire them, or let's say they sacked and massacred indiscriminately wherever they went. At a certain point they were cut down because the same feudal authorities said, what the hell, and cavalry, as we've seen in feudalism, was still rising. So actually even in there you have these guys that are sometimes also, there are actually armies on their own. They have cavalry, but they have also consistent amounts of infantry, but they're destroyed by the elite. Those were dark times that show you how already the concept, however, of mercenarism was spread, how many people you could fundamentally find to hire and to go to war. And the sources of the time have many words to call them. Pillagers, ruptores sive raptores, which is kind of a nice game of words in Latin because it means ruptores, so those who literally destroy. Sive, that is, which means it's the equivalent raptores, right? So those who raid and take everything out that they prey, right? And they were called literally like this because it sounded funny as well, but it wasn't funny at all. Other names were Paleari, Cotarelli, or Cotoro. This is a word of particularly obscure etymology. We don't know if it was because of the small daggers or something, but others were more ethnically determined, but they were synecdoches in a way. The Brabançons, for example, from Brabant, because not all the Brabançons came from Brabant. It was just an area where also had good infantry for time being, and that was very politically fragmented in a way. So distant from main centers of power, so that's also where good infantry tend to spread more frequently. In fact, also the great victories of infantry at the beginning of the 14th century are mostly from the fringes of great monarchies and feudal powers, right? Later on, still in France, which is this system that has a lot of structural problems on the long run because it's huge and you can't control it. Yeah, it has enormous demographic resources. As long as the Capetians manage to put France together, well, the thing holds. But with the crisis of the 14th century and the English invasion, it's a total mess. And the country would have been devastated famously by the Compagnie d'Aventure, right? That in the intervals of peace, let's say, very in brackets, let's say, of the 100 Years' War, they would have raged across the whole country. And that was wild as well. And it changed also literally the economical geography of the country. Like they spread a terrible crisis in here. in fact, these devastations in times of alleged peace or truce were even worse, perhaps, than those of regular warfare of the chevauchée and so on, because also the countries normally stopped war when they were exhausted, and these guys, that's where they started, because they knew that they would have found very few resistance in a way. Also, as we've seen, these companies of fortune would have spread also in Italy, and later, even after the Treaty of Arras of 1435 between France and Burgundy, it would have been the time of the écorcheurs, the scorchers, which is a pretty eloquent term. And it's however difficult to say how concretely the mercenaries were composed altogether. I mean, there were many among the representatives, especially of the poorest of the older aristocrats, that basically preferred to go to war and start implementing their own account. It was simply a business. It was not even just a matter of poverty. There are also very important in the high nobility that starts doing these things. I'm not kidding, right? Think even just about John of Bohemia, king, or it was a true knight errant. But there are lots of the high nobility of France that sometimes even goes to I don't know, to fight in Italy or some, there is something like that. There were then knights/brigands that the type we often find in the Conte and in the Fablieux, that had always been there, right? The knight is born fundamentally as a brigand, right? That there is no difference at the beginning. But at this times, these guys are a bit the scum of European aristocracy, and they are adventurers that are in perennial research of war as their own only, actually, presumably, source of survival, and of maintaining also their lifestyle, but at the end of the day, their only reason of life. This is perhaps what we haven't insisted enough, but I mean, the concept that today we think about making money to eventually have a better life later. These guys didn't know anything like that. I mean, money went spent immediately because there was no other way to stay afloat otherwise, and the only hope was to reach some prestigious title or post, but at the same time, that entailed new burdens and new responsibilities. It was mostly a matter of promotion, but not really of rest, right? This is important because it was a honor just to be a knight and to fight like that. It is what a true man would do with his life. And naturally, these people, I can't say they had an easier, but of course they had it was an extremely violent and tormented life, but at least it was like, okay, I lived that life, right? It's still better than being a peasant that just cannot even move away from his land itself from a point or another. So it's a different perspective. Maybe we'll see another time because the video is very long, but it's a true reason of being for them. But there is also, the masses, also the peasants, the infantry, etc. We look at many emarginated from the urban and peasant world of that were, unsatisfied, emarginated, backbones, criminals. Also unlucky people, let's be honest. I mean, think about all those, who left civilization to go to, I don't know, French Foreign Legion at the outskirts of the world of fighting. It's a way of also romanticism that takes over until literum, we could say. And it was better for them than leaving, for example, of the heavy and poorly paid work of the city and this astonishing physical exertion of the fields. And these were usually young, robust men that believed that they were wasted for that work, right? They didn't just to be maintained by by charity, and they were still in good health to take an arm and go fight. We made a video also, this is just to close, about Roger de Fleur, right, and the Aragonais, the Catalan company, which Montaner describes, and we made a video I think more than 1 year ago, and that is interesting and talks about these mercenaries, and also in a bit of a different context today because it's mostly Mediterranean, and I mean strictly maritime, I mean not the Mediterranean regions only. That gives a pretty good impression of how this war was also business. That is also something we didn't talk much today about, but today is more a political and social analysis, but it's really all economical, as we understand. And you can go look at that and we will talk, of course, about Catalan. The Catalan company we never made a video about, which is also instead very, very important. But anyhow, for today, I stop it here. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.